"Back away from him or I start breaking things that don't grow back." Nobody moved. Theo Larsen said it again, quieter this time, which was somehow worse. The Vethori cargo hauler Unbroken Margin was not, by any reasonable classification, a diplomatic vessel. It was a mid-range freight carrier, operating under a salvage and transport license, issued by the Outer Reaches Commerce Authority, registered out of Cinder Station, and it smelled permanently of coolant fluid and whatever Grix 4 called cuisine. It made the Aldebaran loop every 11 weeks, stopping at 8 stations, delivering agricultural equipment, medical cold packs, and occasionally things that were listed on the manifest as miscellaneous trade goods, and which nobody asked too many questions about. It was not a place where incidents happened. The incident arrived on a Tuesday. Theo Larsen was 31 years old. He was listed in the ship's personnel log as a Grade 2 mechanical technician, which was accurate in the same way that calling the Pacific Ocean a body of water is technically accurate. He had been employed on the Unbroken Margin for 14 months. Before that, he had spent 4 years with the Canadian Armed Forces, 2 of which were with Joint Task Force 2, and before that he had grown up in Kenora, Ontario, in a house that backed onto the lake, and had learned at a fairly young age that the things worth knowing were rarely the things that showed up on any official record. He was lean, medium height, and had the particular stillness of someone who had been trained to exist in environments where unnecessary movement was a liability. The ship's crew had assessed him, over 14 months, as quiet, competent, occasionally funny, and completely unremarkable. The cook thought he was a bit odd. The chief engineer thought he was the best mechanic she'd ever had on the rotation. Both of these assessments were missing the same significant piece of information. Reth was the piece of information most of them were also missing. Reth was a Vethori navigation specialist, the only non-human permanent crew member on the Unbroken Margin, and had been with the ship for 6 years. Vethori were bipedal, gray-skinned, with large amber eyes adapted for low-light spatial calculation, and a cultural disposition toward precision that made them excellent navigators and occasionally exhausting dinner companions. Reth was considered by the crew to be the best navigator in the Aldebaran corridor, and also the individual most likely to spend 40 minutes explaining why a particular route calculation was theoretically suboptimal before agreeing to fly it anyway. Theo and Reth had been friends for 11 months. This had surprised everyone on the ship, including, initially, Reth. The friendship had started because Theo had fixed a calibration error in the navigation array that 3 previous technicians had misdiagnosed, and Reth had said, with the Vethori equivalent of genuine surprise, "You understood what the error actually was." And Theo had said, "It's the same problem I fixed on a targeting system in 2019, different hardware." And Reth had looked at him for a long moment and said, "What targeting system?" And Theo had said, "Different job." And that had been, somehow, the beginning of something. What it had become, over 11 months of long transit corridors and shared late rotation meals and games of chess that Reth won 60% of and Theo won 38% of, and 2% ended in draws that both of them disputed, was the specific kind of friendship that forms between people who are, in some fundamental way, operating at the same frequency. They did not explain themselves to each other. They did not need to. What Reth did need, on a Tuesday in the 4th week of the Aldebaran loop, was someone who was operating at Theo's particular frequency. The problem had a name: Davon Kurath. Kurath was the head of a cargo brokerage firm called Kurath Voss Interstellar, which was, in the Outer Reaches, a name that operated like weather, something you accounted for, worked around, and did not argue with directly. He was 53 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way of someone who had spent money ensuring he stayed that way. And he had, over the past decade, expanded his brokerage operation into territories that were technically under the jurisdiction of the Outer Reaches Commerce Authority, and practically under the jurisdiction of whoever Kurath decided to work with that quarter. 3 weeks earlier, Reth had, in the course of a standard navigation audit for the Orca, flagged a discrepancy in the routing logs of 7 Kurath Voss vessels. The discrepancy, if pursued, would have demonstrated that those 7 vessels had been making stops that were not on their registered manifests, at coordinates that corresponded with known black market distribution points for restricted biological materials. Reth had filed the flag. The flag had gone to the Orca. The Orca had opened a preliminary inquiry. Kurath had found out about the flag within 72 hours, which said something about the Orca's internal security and nothing good. The Unbroken Margin docked at Cinder Station on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, 4 men employed by Kurath Voss Interstellar had boarded the ship under a legitimate cargo inspection warrant, which was technically legal, and had located Reth in the navigation bay, which was not hard because Reth was always in the navigation bay and had made clear that the preliminary inquiry needed to stop. Reth had said with the Vethori precision that occasionally made situations worse, "I filed an accurate report. The data does not change based on who finds it inconvenient." One of the four men had then put a restraint cuff on Reth's left wrist, connected to a cord he was holding, and said that perhaps Reth would like to come and have a conversation with Mr. Kurth about the data. Theo was in the engine room, 2 levels down, when his comm pinged. He looked at it. The message from Reth was 4 words. Navigation bay. Not optional. Theo knew Reth's communication style well enough to understand what those 4 words meant. Reth did not use phrases like not optional. Reth used phrases like statistically inadvisable and temporally inefficient. Not optional was Reth's version of an emergency signal. Theo set down the coupling wrench. He did not run. He walked to the equipment locker at the back of the engine room and opened it, and he was in the corridor 30 seconds later. He appeared in the navigation bay entrance 3 minutes after that, still holding a small diagnostic tool in his left hand, still wearing the gray technician's coveralls with the grease mark on the right sleeve that he'd been meaning to wash out for 2 weeks. There were 4 men in the navigation bay. One of them was holding a cord attached to a cuff on Reth's wrist. One of them was standing by the door. 2 of them were positioned between Theo and the navigation console, arms crossed, which was the posture of people who had decided that their size and number constituted a sufficient argument. Reth was standing very still, which with a Vethori meant something specific. Vethori's stillness was not calm. It was the state of an animal that had calculated its options and found all of them insufficient. Theo looked at the 4 men. He looked at the cord. He looked at Reth. "Back away from him or I start breaking things that don't grow back," he said. The man holding the cord, broad, close-cropped hair, the flat expression of a person who spent his professional life making other people uncomfortable, and had stopped noticing that it had a cost, did not move. He looked at Theo with the assessment of someone cataloging a threat and finding it manageable. "You're the mechanic," the man said. This was not a question. "Grade 2 mechanical technician," Theo said. "It says so on my badge." "Then I'd suggest you go back to the engine room, grade 2, and let the adults handle the business conversation." Theo said nothing. He did not move. This was, in retrospect, the moment that the man holding the cord should have updated his assessment. He did not. What Theo did in the next 22 seconds was not dramatic in the way that confrontations become dramatic when they are described afterward. There was no announcement, no speech, no moment where he explained himself. What the navigation bay's security recording documented was a sequence of movements that the Kurth-Voss Interstellar Internal Security Team spent the better part of a week reviewing in a report that described the ship's Grade 2 mechanical technician as demonstrating a skill profile significantly inconsistent with declared employment history. What the report meant was that Theo moved in a way that the 4 men did not have a framework for. The man by the door was neutralized first, which removed the exit coverage. The 2 men between Theo and the console encountered the specific problem of being positioned for intimidation rather than engagement, which are different configurations and do not convert quickly. The man holding the cord found that the cord was no longer in his hand approximately 1 second, before he found himself seated on the navigation bay floor with Theo's knee on his wrist and Reth's restraint cuff in Theo's other hand. 22 seconds. Reth, who had not moved during those 22 seconds, looked at the 4 men in various states of incapacitation around the navigation bay, then at Theo, who was standing with the same expression he wore when he had correctly diagnosed an engine fault that everyone else had missed. Focused, present, mildly satisfied. "You've done that before," Reth said. "Standard response," Theo said. "To what's," Theo said, in the tone of someone for whom this was genuinely a category with established parameters. Reth was quiet for a moment. With Vethori, silence after a high-stress event was not absence of response. It was processing. "The cord is broken," Reth said. "The cuff mechanism requires a specific key. I can work around it in approximately 4 minutes if you can hold the secondary panel open." "I can do that," Theo said. They worked on the cuff for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The 4 men on the floor remained where they were. The Unbroken Margin's captain, a weathered woman named Jorah Vasic, who had been running the Aldebaran loop for 9 years, and had developed a comprehensive theory that the outer reaches operated on its own physics, arrived 6 minutes later with 2 crew members, and a look that suggested she was not entirely surprised and was entirely unhappy. The Outer Reaches Commerce Authority was contacted within the hour. Kurth Voss Interstellar filed a complaint about unlawful detention of employees. The Orca filed a counter-inquiry about the nature of the cargo inspection warrant. Captain Vasic filed a report that described the incident as security response to unauthorized restraint of crew member, which was accurate, and which said nothing about the specific mechanics of how that response had been executed. 3 days later, docked at Portus Anchorage for resupply, Reth found Theo in the maintenance bay at the aft end of the ship, where Theo spent most of his off-rotation hours. It was a small space, cluttered with components in various states of repair, and it smelled like the particular combination of machine oil and recycled air that Theo had, over 14 months, come to associate with the closest thing to quiet that deep space freighters offered. He was replacing a seal on a secondary coolant valve when Reth came in. Reth did not have the human habit of announcing arrival with small talk. Reth arrived, stood, and spoke when there was something to say. Theo had come to find this preferable to most forms of conversation. The Orca inquiry has been formally elevated, Reth said. The preliminary flag is now a Category 2 investigation. It will not be stopped by pressure from Kurth Voss. Good, Theo said. Your intervention was the reason I was available to confirm the data to the secondary investigator this morning. I know. A pause. Reth's pauses were not like human pauses. They were not uncertainty or hesitation. They were the gap between a calculation completing and the result being delivered. You were JTF-2, Reth said. Theo looked up from the coolant valve. I cross-referenced your response parameters with publicly available data on Canadian Special Operations Training Protocols, Reth said. The movement sequencing, the threat prioritization, the economy of force. The correlation was 94.3%. Theo set down the seal he was working with. 4 years, he said. You did not list it on your employment file. It's not the kind of thing that makes freight companies comfortable. It made me considerably more comfortable 3 days ago. Theo almost smiled. With Reth, almost was the entire vocabulary of certain kinds of acknowledgement. You filed an accurate report, Theo said. You knew what it was going to cost and you filed it anyway. The data was accurate, Reth said. The data does not change based on the cost. No, Theo said. It doesn't. Reth stood in the maintenance bay doorway for a moment. Outside the small porthole above the workbench, Portus Anchorage's docking lights moved in slow rotation, amber and white. I reviewed the personnel logs for the rest of the crew, Reth said. And none of them would have come. Theo picked up the coolant seal again and looked at it. This was not modesty or deflection. It was the way Theo processed things. Through the hands, through the work, through something concrete. They didn't know you needed them to, he said. They would not have come regardless, Reth said with Vethori precision. You came because I sent 4 words and you understood what they meant. Theo did not answer right away. Outside, the docking lights continued their rotation. 11 months, he said.
You pay attention?
Attention is operationally relevant, Reth said. I calculate routes. Attention to detail is the function. Sure, Theo said. Another pause. Longer this time. The maintenance bay hummed with the low frequency of the ship's life support, cycling through its standard rotation. Are you all right? Reth asked. The question landed in the maintenance bay with a specific weight. Not heavy with drama, but with the particular gravity of something unexpected. In 4 years of JTF-2 service and 14 months of freighter work, Theo had been debriefed 11 times. He had filed incident reports, undergone post-operational psychological assessments, sat across from officers who asked precise questions about decision-making and protocol compliance. No one had asked him this question after an incident. The question was always about outcomes, about the documentation, about what had been done and whether it had been done correctly. Reth asked it the way Reth asked all questions, with precision, with genuine inquiry, and with the implicit understanding that the answer would be heard accurately and not judged. Theo put the coolant seal down. Yes, he said. Then, in the same register, thank you for asking. Reth nodded once. With a Vethori, a single nod was not a dismissal. It was receipt of information, acknowledgement of something that had been said. The valve seal, Reth said. You are doing it wrong. I'm not doing it wrong. The torque sequence you're using is the Type 4 protocol. This is a Type 7 valve. Theo looked at the valve, looked at the seal, looked at Reth. It's a Type 7, he said. I have memorized the specifications for every mechanical component on this ship, Reth said. Navigation requires knowing what holds the ship together. You couldn't have mentioned that before I spent 20 minutes on it. You did not ask. I'm asking now. The Type 7 requires a counter-rotation on the third engagement point, Reth said. I can walk you through it. You can walk me through a valve seal. I can walk you through anything with a documented specification, Reth said. The ship runs because I know where it is going. It stays running because you know how it works. These are not unrelated functions." Theo looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has been given a more complete answer than they expected. "Counter-rotation on the third point," he said. "Yes. 30 degrees. Hold it while you set the secondary lock." Theo picked the seal back up. Reth moved into the maintenance bay properly. Not the doorway, but in the way Reth moved into spaces where he was going to stay for a while. He sat on the parts crate along the far wall, the one that had been there long enough that it had unofficially become seating. "The Orca investigator asked about my relationship with the crew," Reth said after a moment. "What did you tell her?" "I said the crew was professionally adequate and the navigation array was well maintained." "That's all?" "I also said that I had one colleague whose judgment I trusted under conditions of operational stress." Theo applied the counter-rotation on the third engagement point. "1?" he said. "The sample size was based on data," Reth said. "I work from data. 94.3% correlation is not a small number." "No," Theo said, "it's not." Outside the porthole, Portus Anchorage continued its slow rotation, amber lights sweeping across the dark in steady, predictable arcs. The valve seal seated correctly this time. Theo set the secondary lock and it held. The maintenance bay was quiet in the way that spaces become quiet, when two people have said what they actually meant and nothing more needs to be added. And the ship continued on its route through the corridor, through the outer reaches, through whatever came next, as it had before and would again.